years ago, I was invited over to Melissa's house when this was a dream. This was first starting. And so it's kind of full circle that last year I joined the board. And so we are a registered nonprofit organization on a mission to use the tools of communication to drive positive systemic change. And you can find out more. I'm going to actually put the link in the chat about us. But my big call to action today is if you haven't already, take the pledge. Join us in that. We are really wanting to be the leaders on the forefront of using storytelling for change making, doing teachings about that, in setting new industry standards. And I think if we can call each other in and be on community, we can do that together. This might be different depending upon if you're at an agency, if you're a solopreneur, if you work at a brand, you might just have questions all the time. And what we hope is that together as a community, we're able to address those and figure things out together when things might seem tricky or you just need support. So take the pledge and join us in that. We'd be so excited to meet you.
Awesome. All right. Thank you for that, Dana. So I'm going to introduce our speakers before we dive on in. And I'm really excited to introduce them both because they come at AI from two different lenses, which I think is really, truly going to be impactful to us today. So first up is Chris G, who is the CEO of Chris G Consulting, where he empowers leaders to harness AI and revolutionize communications by embedding cutting-edge digital strategies to sharpen their competitive edge. I like to say that Chris's wheelhouse and jam is all about AI literacy, and he holds deep expertise at that intersection of not only communications, but equity and AI. And he helps organizations explore how AI mirrors the biases we see in our societies today, along with supporting them with strategies to challenge and build models that are more inclusive and reflective of all communities. Before founding Chris G Consulting, Chris led digital practices for agencies like Edelman, Finsbury, Teneo, and Burson. We're also joined by Nathan Chappell, who is one of the world's foremost experts on the intersection of artificial intelligence and generosity. As the head of AI for donor search, he leads the efforts to bring efficiency at scale through AI for many of the most innovative nonprofits in the United States. He's the founder of the volunteer-led Fundraising AI Collaborative, which is a 10,000 plus member global think tank that's responsible for publishing the world's first framework for responsible and beneficial AI for fundraising. Nathan is also the author of the award-winning book, The Generosity Crisis, The Case for Radical Connection to Solve Humanity's Greatest Challenges. So with that, Dana and I are going to dive on in to our conversation.
Not impressive at all.
Not impressive at all. I mean, we're not worthy.
We're so excited to have you both with us today. And I'm very excited selfishly to learn from you. And what we want to do is to kind of get a pulse in the room. Everyone's coming in with different experiences on AI right now in your organizations. I agree. Woohoo, those bios. Can you share, and I just put this in the chat too, take a second. What are 3 words on how you are entering this conversation about AI today? In the chat, think about what are 3 words. I think one of mine is wonder. I have some wonder about how it's going to evolve, how it can be utilized, how I can personally use it better within my organization and the work I do. I work a lot in recurring, while everybody is answering your 3 words, I work a lot in recurring giving for nonprofits. And so I'm wondering, how can AI responsibly be better utilized in that way to create some efficiencies and community building? How about you?
I'm seeing some stuff in the chat and people seem to be in my head because the one word that from always kind of marinates for me is curious or curiosity. Because, and that's kind of like, there's 2 sides to the coin of that curiosity about what it is and its potential, but then there's curiosity and concern. So that's another word.
Yep.
About the potential impacts, biases, and so on.
I think that might be literally the number 1 word I'm seeing. Almost everyone has said curiosity.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Amazing. Okay. Question number 2 to think about in the chat. Why did you attend today? You clicked RSVP for a reason. Is there a challenge you are looking to solve or brainstorm ideas around AI and impact comms? We'd love to hear from you because you are spending our time with us for the next 45 minutes ish. And so we want to make sure that you come out of this with some hopefully very tangible ideas that you can take back to your teams or the work that you do. So what's your reason for being with us here today? Would love to hear that from you.
Awesome. I see some folks starting to share stuff in the chat, which is great because I think, well, that'll help us as we have the conversation and obviously help with the Q&A. But Dana, I loved your question about the 3 words because I think those kind of nicely open us up to kind of hearing from Chris and Nathan to
Mm-hmm.
start, like what their perspectives are on where we are today with AI, right? Because we have key words, if you will, that are kind of the things that we're all kind of wrestling with, if you will, related
Yeah.
to AI. And I think a framing in terms of where we are today coming into 2025 would be kind of a good grounding for us. So, Chris, do you want to start us off with your perspective before we go to Nathan?
Sure, sure. And first of all, thank you guys both for such a generous introduction, and thanks everyone for having me here. I think that if I were to put 3 words into the chat, my 3 words would probably be similar to everyone else: curiosity, or curious. And then the other 2 words, and this kind of dovetails into the conversation we were having a second ago in the green room, would be optimism and then pessimism, right? Which is kind of a contradiction. But I kind of feel like, if we want to talk about sort of like the landscape and where we are today, I kind of feel like that's where we are today. We're kind of as a workforce and as a society at that intersection of a Venn diagram that sort of has this intense curiosity around AI and all of its wondrous possibilities. This optimism that there's a possibility that it could solve certain things and we can realize certain things. I mean, we've had credible conversations about AI possibly helping to usher in a 4-day work week and solve all sorts of societal problems and medical problems. And then there's also the pessimism. There's a very, very real fear, and that is very much founded in reality, that AI could and possibly will take my job. And there's a lot of speculation
Mm-hmm.
that AI is in some, small part or large part responsible for some of the layoffs that we've seen, to the point where New York Governor Kathy Hochul has mandated and put in an executive order that New York-based companies need to start disclosing whether or not AI plays a role in upcoming layoffs that they plan. So, there's an understanding that it is having some sort of impact, and we're trying to get our arms around it. So that's where we are, and it's not going away. In fact, it's only accelerating. I think, we're going to see a lot of innovations this year. Agents are going to take on a big role, and we can talk about that in a little bit more detail later. But I think that's kind of, if I had to say what the landscape is from what I'm seeing with clients and folks I'm talking to, that's sort of like, I think, where I would kind of map us.
Awesome. Nathan?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to go. And probably my words echo Chris's words. And we were talking also in the green room about, there are really kind of 2 different variations of conversations that most people in AI have about AI. And one half of the conversation happens to be when there's daylight and we're having, we're on a panel with a lot of people that are wanting to learn. The other conversation happens, over a drink, or a happy hour where things go dark a little bit. And both are fun and both are important. I think overall, if I kind of distill those down together, I wrote the words optimistic, because I call myself a hopeful pessimist. It's my orientation that I worry greatly about the future, but I think a lot of people in the nonprofit sector wake up with this kind of altruistic sense that it doesn't matter if the world goes down in flames, that we're going to fight the good fight until the last breath. So that, hopeful pessimist kind of thing comes out in my optimism. Measured, which is just another word, where, Chris was sharing kind of the optimistic and pessimistic side. The measured, for me, is taking on a new meaning, almost a habitual meaning that, we as humans now need to program ourselves habitually to measure not just short-term gains from AI and what it can do today, but what are the long-term applications or implications to that. So measured, I think, is just something that easier said than done. We don't want to use AI irresponsibly, but we also like convenience. Like we
Mm.
know that algorithms are deciding things for us, and we make the choice of whether we, trade privacy for convenience. And then my third is curiosity, and I love seeing that so much on throughout this. In fact, I'm already going to ask whoever is going to get the transcript for this for all the words that you all put in, because I want to make a word cloud of it. I mean, it just curiosity, I believe, is the number one above all other things distinguishing characteristic between winners and losers in AI. That a person who is not curious will not advance and will be,
Mm,
underperforming. They will be outperformed by others that are not data scientists and not brilliant strategists and not the most creative people in the world. They are going to be beat by people who are curious. And so I think asking the question, what if, like you used to do when you were a kid and drove your parents
yep.
crazy, is probably the number one distinguishing characteristic of a person who outperforms in the age of AI. And the good thing is that's something that everyone can learn. Like maybe it
Right.
comes naturally to some people, but all of us can learn to be more curious.
So good.
Those are
Nathan,
my
you're
3 words
speaking.
with a
I
lot
was
of preamble with
just,
that.
it's so good. It's so funny and canny that you just said that. I just wrapped a presentation beforehand and it was all built off of wonder and what if and ideas. And wow, that's just, he had no idea I was doing that either. We're on the same wavelength.
Totally. Totally on the same wavelength. I mean, I think the what ifs, and from a positive perspective, I think are really important because it allows us to start to learn and embrace what this technology is and means and how we can use it for good. But before we go into the good part, the first question that I wanted to ask was kind of focused on why it is we need to be measured, which is around like the harms and the ethical concerns as it relates to AI. So we know there's a lot of conversation, even books that have been written about the inequity that is part of AI. And I'm curious to hear from both of you what your perspectives are behind the why, for the inequity that we see, but then most importantly, what do we need to do to rectify the harm that it can and actually has done when it comes to marginalized and racialized communities? I think we've seen examples of that. Like there was a fake Facebook account that was created that was like a fully AI generated human that was harmful and stereotypical in so many ways. So I'm curious to hear your perspectives on both of those. So Chris, do you want to go first with Nathan chiming on that?
Sure, sure. And I think if I knowing you as well as I do, Abby, I think what you're referring to is the controversy that Meta got into recently, with respect to, I think it wasn't Facebook, but it was some fake profile or AI generated profiles
Yep.
that they had populated onto Instagram. And these profiles had full identities, had an AI generated headshot, AI generated photos of this one in particular, which they build as a I think it was a LGBTQ trans woman or something like that, Black trans woman or something, and even had AI generated kids in her photos and all this kind of stuff. And of course, obviously, it got found out, and it was a public black eye. And I think that it touches on a couple different things, right? One, and you mentioned it a second ago, Abby, about stereotypes, right? Um, I think we have to be very careful when it comes to using AI, and I think so. When we talk about inequities, furthering intolerance with stereotypes, and then AI generated stereotypes. This particular example being one, I think is just an example of where we need to be careful. And it kind of bleeds into the second thing. The whole meta controversy bleeds into the second topic or issue, which is the concept of just because you can do something with AI,
Mm,
should you, right? And I think that's one of the bigger issues that sort of cuts across everything. There are certain things that people are doing with AI which they know they shouldn't be doing. Whether it's spam, more efficiently being able to spam people, more efficiently being able to spread mis and disinformation, et cetera. And then I think that there are a lot of things that are sort of in that sort of gray area because it hasn't been spelled out legally, hasn't been spelled out necessarily ethically. So I think that some of the best things that we can do right now is have this conversation, have these conversations in our organizations, in our boardrooms, in our conference rooms, et cetera, with our colleagues, and really start to talk about what the guardrails are, because all of this is happening at such breakneck speed. And here's the crazy part about it: it's never going to be slower than it is today, right? So we've really got to accelerate these conversations and really think about the consequences of some of our use cases with AI. And then the last thing I'll just kind of say on this, before I'd love to get Nathan's perspective too, is that I think that one thing that I'm keenly aware of, or keeping a watchful eye about, is that all across corporate America and nonprofit America, et cetera, companies and organizations are developing these sort of private on-premise AI tools, whether it's an enterprise solution or it's something a do-it-yourself solution like a notebook LM. And they're using these technologies to sort of create these walled gardens so that they can use AI without being fearful of putting information out there that that could end up in someone else's hands that they don't want out there. And that's great, and that's a necessary thing to do. But one of the things that obviously is one has to keep a watchful eye about with respect to those things is not actually accidentally, inadvertently training these models, these proprietary models, in a way that includes a lot of bias, right? And that can happen in a bunch of different ways. So that's something that I don't think enough conversation is happening around. There's a lot of confirmation around privacy, copyright, all of those types of things, but there isn't enough conversation around mitigating bias.
Now, I think those are very, very important points in the watch list that we need to be thinking of. Nathan, love to hear your perspective and chimes on that.
Actually, so I had the most dreaded thing that could possibly happen on a panel, which is my entire Wi-Fi went out.
Oh
And
no.
it's the first time that it has happened. I'm back, and I actually am on my phone, so hopefully it's coming through okay. So if you could repeat the question, but I popped in right when Chris was saying something that's one of my favorite things to say repeatedly, probably an annoying level, is just because we can doesn't mean we should. It literally should put that on a t-shirt probably, and wear it around. So repeat the question and I'm happy to jump in.
So the question was your perspective on the inequities that exist currently with AI, and then the best approaches to rectifying those biases, particularly as it relates to marginalized and racialized communities.
Oh yeah, so you went deep really quick. All right, so that so that's something that honestly has actually shaped my view on AI since the beginning. I started, I call myself an accidental fundraiser. I was a technologist. I got into fundraising on accident, like a lot of people do, 20 years ago. 2017 started working in machine learning, essentially to measure connection, and machine learning and deep learning was really good at that. But once we started looking at the math and in machine learning, predictive AI is actually very easy to look at how it's making decisions. It's actually, you can look at what's called features or variables, if you will, and each variable has a certain amount of prediction value. So if someone's race comes up as like very high, you're like, wait a minute, this algorithm is extremely biased towards specific orientations. And so predictive AI, back then, it became really important for me to understand how decisions were being made, but also to display how those decisions were being made to the end user. And so while the private sector typically builds AI in what we consider like a black box, so decisions are made, like if it's Facebook, for instance, like we don't understand, we don't get to see the math behind their algorithm and how they're saying you should get this specific ad treatment, right? We're just getting it. And if we interact with it, heaven forbid, we're going to get more of those. And if we don't interact, we're going to get something else. And that's essentially how algorithms are rewarded. We made a commitment in the nonprofit sector early on that really looked very different, which was we will not build AI that can't be fully explained. So either you call it transparent AI or explainable AI, which means that if we build an algorithm, we actually display the math. And the math is not complicated math. It's literally a set of variables. And it could be like, a variable like age, a person's age. Well, like, what does their age have to do with, the likelihood they'll make a donation? Well, actually, it's maybe not as much as if they're likely to make a donation, but how much they give. And so that is a form of bias. And we believe that it's not our job to determine what's appropriate for you as an organization. What are your values of your organization? Now, many organizations use age, which is a bias, in determining who's likely to give, but that shouldn't be our decision. That should be yours. And so taking a kind of a radical approach to mitigating bias requires, one, use machines to identify bias. And we use algorithms that actually identify basically overfitting or bias, but we also use humans. And we use as humans, to essentially also look at things like the things that are the gray area, like race. We would never put race in an algorithm. That's an easy one. But age, like again, going back to that, is like, is that something that's appropriate and right for your organization? And does it depend on how predictive it is versus not? And so that's one way. I think building and supporting transparent AI is kind of a minimum expectation for the nonprofit sector. The nonprofit sector is very different in a lot of ways, but mainly because we don't have products or services that we rely upon if things go really bad. We have trust. We operate in the currency of trust. And therefore, the only metric for good versus bad AI that matters in the nonprofit sector is, does this AI protect and promote trust? You don't need like this huge Gantt chart of like all the different things of like, should I buy or should I use this tool? You need to know, like, in my gut, does this, and by using this tool, does it protect and promote trust? And if you can't say definitively yes, then it requires further exploration. Now, the last point in all this, and it's something that I'm increasingly concerned about, especially in this last week with the inauguration, and this is not a political statement, but AI safety is, in safety, I put ethics and bias in AI safety. So responsible AI, minimum ethical consideration is kind of the minimum threshold for AI safety, is not a priority in the United States. And that's not a political statement. It is not a priority in the United States. And what that does mean, though, is that each and every person who operates in this currency of trust has to ensure that we assume our own responsibility in using, buying, building tools. We cannot defer our responsibility to Meta or Amazon or Microsoft or Google, because their incentives are very different. In a capitalistic society, their incentives are to grow and scale. For every one paper that's written on AI scale, there's only one for every 1,000 papers written on AI scale, like advances in AI, only one paper is written on safety.
Mm.
And again, I put ethics, I put a bias all within the responsible AI bucket. And so that just means it's our responsibility. And I think that's really easy to say, really difficult to do when you go back to Chris, where I stopped, where I came back when Chris's comment is, just because we can doesn't mean we should, because we're confronted with technology that is super impressive and is the easy
Right.
button for so many things that we don't want to do. But just because I can doesn't mean we should. We have to habitually create a mechanism in our brain that every time we interface with a new AI, it asks ourselves that question, like, just because I can doesn't mean I should. Is it aligned with my personal values? Is it aligned with the values of my organization? So that's just something I think as humans now that we have to wrestle with, that we've really never had to as much. We've just been consumers of this data and algorithm, but we need to be drivers of that same technology now.
So good. Thank you, Nathan. I think something that I've seen recently with the horrific LA fires is there's been a lot of unfortunate AI generated content on social platforms
Yeah.
with like animals in the fires. I saw one that was silly. It was like J Lo. It was supposed to be J Lo, like picking up burnt things from a house, getting millions and millions and millions of views. And so I think there's, yes, absolutely, like the human element of these. It's like, what are we building? What are we creating and doing things in a responsible manner? How how can AI be utilized for good, right? And I want to flip it to the positive element for a second, without compromising, obviously, authenticity. And to your point about building trust, like what are some examples that you've both seen of really positive AI best practices? Chris, I'll throw it back to you first.
Yeah, well, I think one of them, Nathan touched on, which is using AI to actually root out bias, in systems, et cetera. I think that's a positive, use and development. One, I think that a lot of, sort of everyday sort of workforce, corporate America workflow efficiencies kind of get mentioned in AI, but I think some of the most exciting things and useful and impactful things are happening in the fields of medicine. Particularly some of the work that radiologists are doing, and sort of like taking, scans and sort of highlighting and drawing on, where the masses are, et cetera, and then feeding those into the AI models has turned out to be a very useful sort of set of backup eyes. to the point where now, these models are not replacing humans, right? AI is not designed to replace us, even though some over capitalist folks will try to do that with it. But but where it's really working is being able to find things that the human radiologists miss, right? Because every single one of those misses is potentially someone who might, have cancer being able to spread in their system, in their body. So I think that there are some very optimistic and good use cases that are happening, and then also I think that there are some exciting things happening in terms of the way that AI is being used for things like mental health, to address mental health, et cetera. So I think that once again, in my workshops and everything, I always say, the optimistic part of me comes out and says, listen, we don't need. It's not the robots we need here; it's the humans, right?
Mm.
If we decide to use AI for things like better medical outcomes, to address health inequities, to address bias and mitigate different societal ills that we haven't been able to sort of wrap our arms around solutions for, then we will see an improvement in our future. Or if we use it to get rid of people, to put people out of work, to more efficiently spread hate, to concentrate resources amongst the few, and take them away from many, then we're going to see the opposite, right? So I'm encouraged by some of the things that I'm seeing, and I think that there are potential use cases in other areas that we haven't even thought about yet.
So good. Nathan, how about yourself?
Yeah, I would echo all of that. I mean, I think AI is an amplifier. It's a mirror that reflects our values, right? And what we put into it is what we'll get out collectively. So to me, there's a lot at stake in that. I'm super encouraged. I started out 20 years ago working at a Boys and Girls Club, like the smallest of the small. Like it was this old Boys and Girls Club. Super passionate about it because I grew up going to Boys and Girls Club when I was a kid and all these things. But I was one person, doing this whole thing. And if I literally can just go back in time and be like, oh my gosh, if I had, modern AI, generative AI then, I would have just crushed it. Like it would have made my life, I would have been happier, I would have done my job better, all these things. I would have been able to amplify the work that I wanted to do with my mission. And not surprisingly, today I'm seeing the greatest innovations and the most creativity in the nonprofit sector coming from the smallest organizations. They're coming from the organizations that the need for innovation it lives where the need where the need is the greatest. So like innovation really just blossoming in these areas from scrappy, curious people that are like, what if we use this to amplify and then do it in ethical ways? I think of Dan Kershaw at the Furniture Bank in Toronto. I mean, he's like a four-person team that is like outperforming everyone around him because he's using AI in a very, very transparent ways. He created an AI manifesto and how and why they use AI and published it on their website with a use case. So I know when people are talking about like how do you do this responsibly, like you do it responsibly, and have AI help you do it responsibly, versus hiding behind it. And so I look across the country and I'm very hopeful because I see these like small, medium-sized nonprofits that are just shining. They're outperforming in ways that they would before. To be honest, like the biggest ones, I get more worried about it. They're kind of bogged down in the bureaucracy of like, oh, well, we can't make a decision on what AI we use now until we have our AI committee make this decision. And by the way,
Hmm.
they were formed 6 months ago, and we haven't bought any tools since then. And meanwhile, all the people are coming to work and using shadow AI underneath their desk because it's not approved. I worry more about the bigger bureaucratic organizations than I do the small, scrappy ones. But that still means that we all have to understand what AI safety means, responsible AI means, and beyond responsible AI, what beneficial AI means. And what I mean by that is this is a term that we use a lot in fundraising AI, is that AI can't just serve your short-term interests. If it serves your short-term interest, it can actually raise more money or do these things faster. But at the same time, like social media being a communicating device, right? It's a device to bring people together, has unintended consequences and long-term consequences. How do we then, wake up every day and recognize and evaluate AI based on how is it helping me today, and what is my responsibility to protect future generations? And I think it's a big responsibility. But I think we all play that role of saying, don't just use AI to gain short-term gains if it has, the potential for harm in the future. And so I think it's an area that the nonprofit sector is a little bit different, but it goes back to just because we can do something doesn't mean we should.
If there is, I just want to like piggyback on real quick when you're talking about if there are listeners today that have committees set up and they're feeling that where it's like we're just not moving. What are some recommendations to make sure that doesn't happen? There can be intentional action that takes place.
I can give a real quick or are you asking the audience or are you asking me?
Oh, I'm asking you.
Oh, and Chris would have a nice purview on this as well. I mean, to me, I think it really comes down to leadership. I mean, 2025 is not a year of, bits and bots. It's a year of people and culture. I believe 2025, the winners and losers will be completely defined by how an organization creates a curious culture, and that comes from
Mhm.
leadership. If
Yep.
you are not allowed to express curiosity, if you're not allowed to try new things, if you're not allowed to ask why or what if, your organization will have a very hard time in this day and age moving forward. That has to come from leadership. Leaders have to. And so if you're in an organization that does not reward curiosity, I mean, not to say just jump ship right now. If you can't influence a different culture, um, I will tell you at Donor Search, we have a bottom up approach. We have this AI coffee chat, and we actually incentivize it by offering 25 DoorDash gift cards because we actually do it during lunch. And to be honest, like we're learning about AI, and I lead AI, but we're learning about different uses of AI at Donor Search from people that like I don't even know well in our organization that are like, oh, I just created this video to explain how this thing works within our system. So clients can accelerate their learning. It's actually happening from the bottom, but at the top you have to allow for that. And I again, super easy, but if your organization is stuck and not moving forward, then I think, to be honest, I think the future is probably pretty clear for you. Not you, but your organization. Let's be
Yeah.
clear about that.
Yeah.
You have choice, you
Yeah.
have agency
That's
over where
right.
you work.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah. And I think all of that is right. And I would add, I think that one thing that I see when I look at a lot of organizations and how they put together their AI steering committees is they're making a couple of different errors or mistakes, I should say, in their approach. One is that all too often they're too top heavy, right? It's we're going to get all of our VPs or SVPs and what have you, and it's going to be a very political thing to be on this committee, and it's not necessarily the people who are using AI in the organization that have the most expertise. And then also I think that they leave out a lot of functions, right? A lot of times IT will be involved, maybe compliance or legal, et cetera, HR, but maybe not, and we're talking about communicating. Comms is typically not necessarily at the table, in these steering
Mhm.
committees that I've seen, et cetera. So, I think you've got to bring more people to the table. I'm having more than one steering committee. I think that there's a lot of practicality to having a lot of senior leaders who are decision makers and control budgets and things like that who have a seat at the table. But have more vertical integration in other formal and informal subcommittees as well. You want to, Nathan's right, you want to spark as much curiosity and eventually innovation as possible. The other mistake I find is that they just have these committees and there are no expectations, there are no timelines, there are no milestones, and most importantly, there's no budget, right? And it's not the way that we lead any other successful committee in corporate America, right? Or any other successful initiative. If you're in corporate America and you run a department or a practice or a team or whatever, you're going to you started out 2025 with a goal, right? And you don't just get to aimlessly bounce around and see if you're going to hit that goal, right? You're going to have regular meetings with your CFO or your CEO or whomever it is, to make sure that you're on track. If you're off track, what do we need to get back on track or whatever? So I think the same thing needs to happen with these AI steering committees. There have to be some, a little bit more practicality and rigor put into it. What are we trying to achieve? Let's have a goal. Let's have an objective. That can change, but let's start out in a direction and knowing what we think success ought to look like, and measure it and track towards it. Course correct if you need to. And then on top of that, you've got to give a budget, right? I mean, I've worked with companies that, I'll do a workshop on AI integration and all this kind of stuff, and we're talking about things that they can do to automate their processes, et cetera. And they don't even have the ability to spend $20 a month on ChatGPT Plus, right? So I think that like you've got to, if it's important to you, just like anything in corporate America or in organizations, nonprofits, et cetera, if it's important to you, you put budget behind it.
Mhm.
Intentional action and support investment, 100%. I think this all goes for everyone here today too. If there's something that you've been wanting to try, push forward within your organization, within like yourself to try and test, is to give it the support, the education. You're here gathering that. What is the action then going to happen afterwards to be able to put the investment in it and do that? Thanks, Chris.
And one quick work hack also could be, if you're in this organization that's kind of in between sizes and not sure where they're going with this, is don't propose an AI committee, propose an efficiency committee. And the reality is AI is about efficiency, but for 100+ years, organizations have rewarded people for getting together and be like, okay, everyone, we're going to shut the door and we're not leaving here until we learn how to cut our expenses by 10% or something like that. Like, organizations love efficiency. So, and that's what AI really does, right? It helps you work, better, faster, and at the end be happier because you're working better and faster. So, suggesting a committee that's going to, kind of, work on ways to creating efficiency or amplifying or whatever you want to call it, your organization, rather than being an AI committee, you might get more traction or buy-in to the start. And to Chris's point, if your organization is not willing to spend $20 a month to do something to basically give you AI superpowers, I'd actually be pretty concerned about that right now. I mean, ChatGPT was down this morning at 7:03 in the morning when I was having my coffee, and I was like, I'm just going to take the day off. Like, why even try anymore? Like, and so like for $20 a month, you're talking about like it's literally a drop in the bucket in terms of the productivity gains, which are at minimum around 20% productivity gains in the private sector, upwards of 40 to 50%. So, I mean, for any nonprofit professional, that's a 20% gain. That's a day a week. That's a lot of
That's
time that you
huge.
can help your organization, gain the dividend of time with.
I'm curious in the chat, would you share with us, if you're open to, are you being asked by clients to advise on AI best practices and incentives and programs? Or are you thinking about AI more from an internal, personal team usage? I would just be curious, or both.
Oh,
Okay. Nicole's saying both. Okay.
both are saying both. Yeah. Yeah. And I would imagine it's a bit of both, because to Chris's point, when you look at kind of just from a workforce perspective, there's so many ways in which people are looking at this to make our work efficient. But then also clients across the board, for profit and nonprofit, are trying to find not only what their point of view is, but how they can use it to service their business or work in service of their mission, right? Which is why, to everyone's point, I think these committees are coming together. And I would say that one of the greatest challenges a lot of these people are having is not only how do they make sure they get the right voices around the table, but how are they making sure that they have the right KPIs and metrics to make sure that they're hitting things like privacy, inclusivity, and accessibility. Because, you know, we know that there are big players in the space, but the only way you're going to address some of those biases is if you bring the right voices to the table. And some of it is with your people, and some of it is in partnership with other organizations that are actually trying to build more inclusive models.
Sorry to jump in here, but something Nathan said really sparked a thought, with me. I wholeheartedly agree that there need to be, I think having an efficiency committee makes sense, because that is, to your point about 20% and 40% efficiency gains. That is a real benefit of AI. But I think that like what probably should be a good companion piece to that, or a good follow-up piece to that, would be to establish innovation committees or steering committees, et cetera, because that's the next step, right? I mean, what we want to do is we want to free up time to do things that have more impact, right? And so as we start to see some of these efficiency gains, where should our focus go? Where should our focus be? And what is the dream state? What are the things that we've always wanted to do that we thought we just didn't have enough time to do, or we didn't have the ability to do, right? Well, as we start to realize some of these efficiency gains, we'll start to move further down that sort of maturity model. We're at the very beginning where we're just basically taking what we know and we're using the technology and applying it toward it. So it's almost similar to back when the iPhone first came out, and we thought, great, I don't have to carry my feature phone and my SLR at the same time anymore, and I can browse the web while I'm on the train or something like that, right? We could have never imagined the innovations that would come years later, like Uber, right? Which would have been possible without smartphone proliferation. So, what is that Uber? What is that technology or innovation that we never would have thought about in our business, in our lives, et cetera? Now that we have this time freed up from these rote tasks. And I think that regular time needs to be spent on that as well, really kind of shaping the future that is probably not as distant as we think now.
So I know Dana, we're close to the time where we might have to open it up for questions, but Chris, I think, kind of nicely gave us the gift of one of our questions, which is if we wanted to kind of look into a crystal ball, where do you think we'll be with AI a year from now?
The eyes go big. Wait. And quick, if I can have, could each of you just share? I'm a very tactical learner, and I was doing some research on this in the nonprofit space, but I'd love to hear from each of you, and then we'll go into that, a practical example of how it's being used around amplifying impactful storytelling. And maybe Nathan, from your perspective, maybe donor engagement. And while you're thinking, I will share one that I thought was very cool. And I am obviously semi-obsessed with recurring giving in the nonprofit sector. I think it's the most sustainable, predictable revenue stream that orgs can have. There's an AI tool called Dataro in the nonprofit space that's utilized for gathering data insights of donors. And Greenpeace Australia utilized them to target what they called at-risk monthly donors. And it saved 531 donors from churning over 9 months, raising an additional $235,000, utilizing AI, specializing on just curating a personalized communication. And they did thank you calls. And just by being thanked, but without the data to understand that that's where they were at in their journey, they wouldn't have known that those people might have been at risk of leaving them. So with that one idea, Chris, do you have a thought of something that you've just seen? You talked about, it was just so perfect, the parallel to innovation. Have you seen something really innovative and creative recently?
Well, I don't work with a ton of nonprofits, but I do work with
it can
some.
be any. It can be any sector.
Oh, any sector. Yeah, I think that well, one of the, I don't know how big of an it's not sort of like a AGI type of innovation, but I think that one of the more practical innovations that we're starting to see become used a lot more often, and I mentioned it I think at the outset, is Notebook LM, right? And it's from Google Labs. It's free to use. And one of the things that I've found that people are starting to use it for, it has a number of different things that it's able to do. You're able to train it with your own documentation. It's not open to the web. It's not trained on the web, so it's only trained on what you give it. But one of the features that is really a great byproduct of it is that you can give it information, you can upload a really complex research report or a really boring report or so, and then you can then press a button and have it generate an audio file that it'll create like a two-person podcast interview out of it, right? And and it's great. I actually gave it some content on my website, and if there's a male and female voices, and they're like, oh yeah, so Chris G Consulting does all this really cool stuff with AI, blah blah blah. Oh yeah, I think I've heard it. It was really really funny, very kind of it was a little cheesy, but I love podcasts. So that's a great way for me to take on information in a way that's entertaining for me, right? So I use it for whenever I have to consume a lot of boring information or complex information. And the more I've talked to folks in social settings, whatever, I'm finding out that more people are starting to use it as well for that purpose.
Amazing. Very cool. Thank you for sharing, Nathan.
Yeah, and I mean, I love Notebook LM. I literally started using it the day it came out. It's like mic drop technology. Like if you're not using it, you should use it to either enhance your learning or figure out how to communicate better. I'd be remiss in not talking about Donor Search. So Donor Search competes with Dataro, except that we've been doing it longer. But also, actually, Dataro, they're really good friends of ours, and actually, they serve on the advisory board for Fundraising AI, and so they're so into the responsible AI. So there's lots of room for everybody in the space. But of course, donor search, we've been predicting who's likely to give and give again since 2017. We're like really good at it. But on the practical, so that's on the predictive AI side. On the generative AI side, I mean, it's honestly like being curious about what's next. Literally yesterday, there's this new app that I learned about that just came out called Typo, Typpo. It's an app on your phone. You can, well, actually, Dana and I know someone, a good friend of our, Mallory Erickson, who notoriously leaves very long voice memos that are just, you have to like block time on your calendar to listen to her voice memos. And Typo takes your dictation of your typo. Now, go back to privacy. This is none of your data is private. If you're not paying for a product, you are the product. So if you're not paying
Right.
for it, you are it. So don't, I actually left her a voice memo yesterday with Typo, and it takes your words and it actually visualizes it into this like really stunning. You can pick different backgrounds, and it was just, it's really cool. I was thinking
Cool.
about like how cool would this be just to like send a voice memo video to a donor and be like, hey, I was just thinking about you today and like wishing you a wonderful day. You mean so much to our organization. And it's just something new and different and free. I'm not leaving my
Mm.
security number. I'm not leaving like how much you made it on your last donation, but so like Notebook LM and Typo and gosh, like so many, if you're curious to like think about like how can this technology be used? How can it be used to, promote and protect trust? How can it be used to engage? And I think you're going to find really, fun and creative ways to do that. And again, it's like these cost like nothing. They're either like free or nearly free. And one thing that we can be assured about is that the worst AI you'll ever use today. So like Sora is a great, communication device. It creates 10-second videos to explain or like visualize something. It's horrible. Like, I mean, not horrible by all, it's insanely impressive technology, but it's the worst it'll ever be. In a year from now, Sora is going to be amazing. And so to be able to do this and be like, create a video of somebody helping someone plant a tree or whatever it is, and it just does this is amazing. We are in the infancy of the AI revolution. Like, I mean, we're in the infancy. Like, we're gonna look back several years from now, like, oh my gosh, like, can you remember when we thought Notebook LM was cool? Like, because it's gonna be so much better. And it doesn't happen in a linear fashion, it happens in an exponential fashion because it's not like one person wearing a hoodie programming like, well, what if Notebook LM could do this thing? AI is training AI, which makes it exponential
Mm.
technology, which is also why we need to learn to adapt faster. And we need to learn to just adapt and be curious and then try new things and not get frustrated when things don't go our way, but know that tomorrow is a new day and the next day and the next day. So
Right.
experiment and share. The best way to learn about what's working and not
Yes.
working is just to share things with each other and be like, hey, I tried it for this thing, it was really cool. Or I tried this for, with this thing and it didn't work at all. So I did it this way instead. And that's how we learn from each other.
So good. I love all the drops of the different tools and ferociously Googling here on the side to share them with everybody. And if anybody has to, Rob, we're going to get to the questions. I just dropped both Nathan and Chris's LinkedIn. Please reach out to them. Obviously, you are both a wealth of knowledge. I'm just like sitting here, like soaking in everything. I'll turn it back over to you. I know we were going to ask that final, like, year. I don't know if you want to do the year from now or if we want to ask one of the questions from the chat. There's some good ones.
I think we should ask the questions in the chat because I know we only have
Okay.
about 8 left. So we started to kind of answer this a little bit, but the first one is about bias, which is, I mean, we know that as we said earlier, I like to refer to it as garbage in, garbage out. And that's why the bias is in the systems, because the system only knows what people put into it. And unfortunately, a lot of the folks who are building these models are from the majority and come into it with a lot of bias. So the question was, if we create a white baseline, aren't we automatically creating bias in how AI works? And I would say the answer to that is yes, but I think there are ways, and we are starting to see people try to mitigate for that. So I'd love to hear both of your perspectives, Nathan and Chris, on that, and how we solve
Yeah.
for that.
I can speak to the nonprofit sector that every CRM is full of bias data. That for 40 years, most nonprofits have been using wealth data to identify who's the best person to solicit. And that wealth data has largely been biased based on rich white men. And so to your point, you're starting inherently with an extremely biased data set. Now, that doesn't mean you can't or should not use it. It means you need to be aware of it and you need to work proactively to mitigate that. And so that's why, like, when you're doing predictive AI and you're making decisions based on who we're going to solicit, we actually made a conscious decision back in 2018. We remove all wealth data from our models because actually wealth data is extremely biased. So we don't use wealth data in our models at all. We use data that represents a person's connection to an organization. That's a very different approach to that. So I think there's ways to say, look, I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm going to be aware of the limitations of what biases that I know about that exist. You'll always have bias. All data sets have bias, and if you say they don't, you're lying. But that you're going to make a conscious decision to use it in ways that actively minimizes bias, and then both through computers and humans make this a proactive and consistent task. So you can't just remove bias one time, especially in regenerative is harder, but in predictive AI, like that is unsupervised, that's learning on its own, that the bias can creep in at any given point. So, having human intervention, deliberate human intervention continuously to check and mitigate bias is super, super important. On generative, very, very hard because we're putting so much stock and faith in the people who created those foundation models. And they're constantly, I mean, they have a lot of incentives to not be biased because, they're publicly traded companies and they want to remain publicly traded companies. But that doesn't mean like the training sets that have been used and even how they were procured have like inherent bias in them. And so I think it's just taking a very proactive approach to not essentially, I guess the best way to say this for me is I don't take a trust and verify approach with generative AI. So like most of our corporate values are like trust and verify. Someone has, assume they have best intent. I don't take that approach with Gen. Like with Gen AI, I take approach of, verify then trust. And mainly because I'm in the nonprofit sector. In the private sector, and Chris, this is where it might be a little different. In the nonprofit sector, we operate in the currency of trust. I feel like we have to take a verify then trust approach. If I was in the private sector and selling products, I don't know if I would care as much. I don't know, Chris, does your answer differ?
Right. I mean, I think that, we've seen this in some of the AI tools that have been, I might say rushed out to market because, to your point, sort of staying on track with the profit projection was, outweighed the sort of AI safety concerns. So I think that you're probably right in terms of the private sector versus the nonprofit sector. And then also I would say, in addition to what great comments you made about mitigating bias, is that one thing that's interesting, just on a personal note that I've seen, here in New York, there's one thing that started to become a little bit more popular is these sort of facial recognition panels to get you into your apartment, right? So you don't need a fob, you don't need a code or whatever. You can just kind of put your face up against the thing, and it'll read your face and let you in. Well, I used to live in a place that had one of those, and it would repeatedly fail. Right, I'd come up there, boom, try it again, boom, boom, I'd have to get my face almost perfectly centered or whatever for it to let me in, to the point where I just started using my fob all the time. But that's an example of, and then of course, my white neighbors I'd be sitting there on my fourth attempt, and they'd just come walk right up and and it would let them right in. And that is, that form of bias comes from the fact that there are more than likely far fewer, African American men, pictures of African American men in that data set, right? So it is not necessarily trained on my features, and so that's why I have a much harder time. I found a similar thing as I test out headshot programs, AI generated headshot programs. Some of them do a great job of capturing me, my face, and generating likenesses that look like me, and then others, there are two in particular. I don't want to name them, reface, where they make me look like Tracy Morgan. So funny comedian, but doesn't look like me. So I think that it shows up in lots of different ways, and I think that I think you're spot on, Nathan, as usual. That is something that you have to watch for continuously. I think a lot of folks sort of raise their hands in success, like, hey, we rooted out the bias or something. You rooted it out today. You didn't root it out forever, right? So it's something that you constantly have to monitor, just like you have to monitor for, the presence of private information.
So good. I know we like 1 minute left. We should probably go ahead and wrap to be conscious of time. And I thank you both so, so much for your time and generosity in being with us today and with ICI. We really appreciate the work that both of you are doing in this space. And so please, listeners and those of you that are watching after the fact, please connect with both Chris and Nathan to learn more about their work. We really want to see you all again at our next Impact Council. It's going to be happening Wednesday, February 5th at 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern. And we're going to be talking about how Impact Comms can engage in intergenerational learning during social political swings. Very timely with the inauguration and the new federal administration. So we're going to be joined by a former NFL player, Jonathan Holyfield, who served as the ED of the White House Initiative on Historically Black Colleges and Universities during Trump's first administration. So if you want to register for that, I don't know if ICI team, if we can drop a link to that to register, but we hope to see you there. And Nathan, Chris, again, just echoing, thank you so much for a tremendous panel discussion and joining us today.
It's truly an honor. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Link just came through if anybody wants to grab that link. Thanks, guys.
Oh, links in the chat. Perfect. Yeah. Amazing.
Thank you to our speakers.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.